So just then to sum up, hopefully I've shown you that with graph databases we can take the syntax used by the business, their terminology, their descriptions of everything, and just drop it into a database. And just drop it straight in. No translation and nothing. We just put it straight in there. Hopefully I've demonstrated that tonight. Certainly what I'm aiming to do. This is already cropped up. It's easier to learn than SQL. I'm sure there's things buried in CYPHER, that, some of the more powerful corners of it that are hard. The docs are still evolving on it, so there will be things in there. But for most queries, it's much easier than with SQL. For fun, we also have this data set in a relational database. And for fun, we actually do try writing queries against it. So far, we've managed to write every single SQL equivalent of everything we have. Sometimes that's taken over a day, though, just to come up with the SQL for some of them. Partly because we're deliberately not changing the data set dramatically to make it easier to query with a relational database. So, but with CYPHER, it's much easier. So I believe that's very true. The majority of queries are much easier to write.
It's not because your data sets are optimized for cycling.
Not at all. Not at all. Our historian has never used it. And he will, if he watches this talk, he'll probably say afterwards, I still don't understand the graph database. He doesn't need to. That's one of the beauties of this. He doesn't need to understand it. He can still describe things in his way, and we just put it into the database and it just works. It's fantastic. He doesn't need to know. It doesn't get in his way for a second, which I think, from a business point of view, has allowed the business to do so much on the data side. If you start playing with CYPHER, when you're trying to figure out what you're trying to do, say it out loud. Write that down. That's going to be the structure of your query. Don't get stuck with path traversal. If you find you're doing something regularly, shorten the path deliberately. Change your data set. Just because it's a graph doesn't mean you have to traverse 20 paths in order to feel validated by using a graph. There's nothing wrong with shortening paths.
How difficult is it to introduce a new relationship to a data set when you're path shortening?
Swap, match, for create, and it's that simple. If memory serves, I've got this wrapped in libraries. I don't write a lot of raw CYPHER myself these days. I've got libraries doing all this. If memory serves, it's simply create, record, and the relationship, and then you do set, and then I showed you how you named records. So you do set A equals, and then you just put a piece of JSON in to say what its contents are. It's pretty much that simple.
So a record's represented as JSON under the surface in?
It's not a full JSON document. I don't believe it does nested objects. I'm pretty sure it's only one level deep. But you'd write it as JSON syntax. Certainly I do anyway in my libraries. And just because it's a graph database, you don't have to throw out all the old techniques. Data dimensions were invented way before people had viable graph databases. They've been around for a very long time. But they work even better in graph databases than in relational databases, I'd say. And there'll be other techniques as well. So don't get, I guess the main message with all of this is just because it's a graph, don't think there's only one way to use it. Use it to serve you and your needs. And that's it. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Is there such thing as a schema for graph databases where you can define what types of nodes are allowed, what types of relationships, or anything like that?
If memory serves, no. The Enterprise Edition, I think, has something around that. We're using the Community Edition. I did have some slides about Neo4j and their business model I took out for time, but broadly, so MySQL's business model was download the code, use it for free, we'll sell you people and time to help you with it. In Neo4j's business model is different. They're very much about the software licenses for the Enterprise Edition. But there is a Community Edition, it's GPL3, nice, and you can do a lot with it, which is what we use. I've never needed to look at the Enterprise Edition, but I think the Enterprise Edition may have something like that in it. But if you go on for Neo4j's website, you have to hunt around for a while to find it, but there is a comparison table on there. with all the things in there. And that may be one of them. But we're certainly not doing any schemas whatsoever. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Presumably there are injection possibilities in the same way you can have SQL injections.
I would assume so, but if we're using name parameters, it should deal with that.
Yeah. So you're always using it.
Yes. But of course, just like with SQL, you can always assemble the CYPHER query just as a plain string and do it that way. So if you don't take advantage of name parameters, I would assume there would be injection risks by that.
Successful intrusion, is that right?
I don't, but I don't know anyone else is using it. Not in a production generic sense like we are. I'm not saying people aren't, but none of my peers are using it that I'm aware of. So, and obviously in a wider circle, they're not going to admit if they've had a security problem, sadly.
No, well,
Yeah.
people do report them to or something like that.
Yes, my experience is only when they're absolutely forced to. But that's just my experience.
So kind of along that same model, what's it like for kind of setting permissions and things like that? Is that quite straightforward? Some of these have...
I believe permissions are again in the Enterprise edition.
Right.
But as with MySQL, I don't bother. It's, for me, apps log into databases, not users. It's apps that control who can see data, not the users.
So you did mention that they were going through a database API, so the end users who are writing queries,
Yeah.
in this case, write that through your library.
Actually, they don't. The end users are staff, and they actually Neo4j ships with a built-in web console that you can point your browser at. It's really nice, actually. You can write CYPHER with syntax highlighting, and it will actually render a graph out of the results. It's really nice.
I was about to ask if there's any tools for like browsing data sets and
There are.
visualizing it all.
You'll soon find there's not enough horsepower to because the graphs visualize using JavaScript, which again is another slow language, and it's running in a browser which has very slow rendering properties. The moment you get more than 100 or 200 nodes on the screen, it doesn't matter how much horsepower and graphics power you're throwing at it, it's not optimized to render that well. It can't, not from JavaScript. It doesn't have the API access it needs. So they have launched a desktop app, but it's part of the Enterprise subscription, so I've not seen it and used it. But it's possible that has native rendering. Obviously, browsers don't have native rendering that you can access from JavaScript. So, but yeah, for normal queries, it's great. Yes, please.
Do you always have to put the business logic in the PHP layout, or can you put this kind of stored procedures as well?
You can write Java libraries to run on Neo4j if you want to. So you could do it that way, and there is a mechanism to execute them. You have to upload jars to the deployment, though. You don't.
So it's like a separate layout rather
Yeah.
than built in like MySQL.
Not quite. 'Cause, I mean, with MySQL, you can. So you might be thinking about UDF versus stored procedure. I'm assuming. So it's more like a UDF than stored procedure in that respect. We're not using that. We've got the business logic further up. That's my fault. I'm used to building architectures for scale, and the first thing you do is you simplify your database and what it's doing as much as possible, because the database is always the hardest thing to scale. So first rule of scaling is you move your logic to the next tier up, the one that scales horizontally.
It's like the discussion we had with our database. Quite easy.
Right.
Really put the logic.
Yeah. I have a story, but it's one for the pub. I can't tell you it on camera. But I have a story that may help you with your arguments. Any more questions?
Completely tangential, but you said the site was WooCommerce and WordPress.
Yeah.
Are you skipping over to a different framework or use for these pages, or are you writing a plugin?
The pages are rendered using the WordPress plugin.
Right.
So that calls the data API, which is then powered by the search queries are powered by Neo4j. There's other internal tools as well for the marketing team to help them with their social media campaigns that I've written as well. And at some point, when the data set covers enough clubs, I imagine they'll turn that into a business in its own right, because the clubs don't have this information. I know that for a fact. So, which was a bit of a surprise.
Football managers sell their data.
Sorry?
Football manager
Right.
sell their data
Yeah.
to clubs.
Right. Well, hopefully we can take. My client can take some business off them then. Oh dear. Any more questions?
I suppose we could also like benefits and the nice things about these graph databases. Are there any pain points?
Yes.
Um,
So I mentioned the community edition, which is what we're running. It doesn't have backup support. So to do backups, that's a paid-for feature. It's the only paid-for. The only reason I know it's a paid-for feature is it's the only thing I've really, really missed. So we have to shut it down to do backups and back up the files on disk, and that can take a while because the files aren't small. It can take on a PCI attached storage. It can still take up to 5 minutes to back up this data set.
and does it do replication?
The Enterprise Edition does.
Of course.
However, I'm confident I can scale this without needing the Enterprise Edition. But that would be a completely different talk. And yeah.
Does it do anything special with the backups that would mean you couldn't use some sort of snapshotting file system to?
Well, the problem with any sort of snapshot in the file system is you've got to make sure the app has flushed all its buffers. Otherwise, you can't guarantee the files are in a consistent state. And that's not unique to Neo4j. That's anything where you're using snapshots to do backups. So as long as the app has a snapshot capability. Now, potentially, you could write one of these server-side Java's libraries, upload the jar, and maybe there's an API you can use there to force a snapshot, so you could do, so you can force the flush, so you could then do a backup. Maybe. I don't know. I've not looked into it, but that might be an option. Might be. It's using Lucene as the main storage engine underneath. They are several years into partially migrating away from Lucene for performance reasons, and they've. I reckon they'll be carrying on that for several more years. As adoption grows, I forgot to mention, these guys have been around 17 years. This isn't new stuff. This is not new stuff. 17 years, completely bootstrapped. Well done to them for that. But graph databases are now in the spotlight as a thing people want. And so I think we'll see them constantly evolve the product and the community edition and continue to migrate away from Lucene as a result of that, as more and more demanding customers come to them.
What's the main competitors in Neo4j?
Couldn't tell you. Probably Mongo, because Mongo added some basic graph support. Yeah, 3.4 or 3.6 added it. Now, of course, Mongo at the minute doesn't do ACID, so I would never recommend it for general business use. ACID's the main feature coming in Mongo 4. Then you've still got Mongo's unique querying approach, shall we say.
And authentication.
Yeah. Well, I've not used it in anger, so.
We've done that in the past, haven't we?
Mongo.
Now it's my job.
You're talking about Jeff. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
So, Mongo, I was in the audience at Mongo Europe in 2016, and they had a slide showing that they've got over 50% of the entire NoSQL commercial market. But I believe Neo4j is number 2 in that market. But Mongo has over 50% of that entire market. And my guess is the share's gone up, not down since then, in the 18 months since that point. Mongo are very good at selling their product. Well done to them for it. So, any more questions? No? Well, I've got one for you. Have I tempted you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Data I deal with has a lot more
I think one might more deep.
unique entities than that.
Yeah.
I think it
But the
actually
queries
quite
that you
well
make
with,
in a relation database are
I've been thinking.
easily, you can end up doing inputs and joins. Whereas that simplifies it.
Yeah. Hopefully then that will help.
To Rich on Monday.
Move it to the middle of the 4 billion each year. Fortunately, I'm in operations and in dev, so I can tell them this about this amazing.
And then the devs go, oh, you never guess what? They're just telling us what to do now over there in Ops.
Oh dear.
Would you recommend
change.
using this as like a primary source of data, or would you still, like with Elasticsearch, I keep my source of truth in MySQL and then import the data into Elasticsearch and have it always importable?
That is a good question. I'll be honest, right now, it is not our system of record. It powers all our queries, like you would use with Elasticsearch. We're using it as a replacement for Elasticsearch because we're searching records on relationships rather than on, we're not doing like Google-style search. But we will be adding Elasticsearch to the mix at some point because its text searching is, other than regexes, it's quite limited.
Yeah.
As we start writing data editors so we can go from one historian to a pool of them, we're going to have to write a UI for that. We're going to be doing fuzzy matching and stuff, and we'll have to use Elasticsearch to make that work. So today, our primary data is in MySQL, so I can always rebuild this database.
Yeah.
But it is so long since I've rebuilt the Neo4j database, I know that code doesn't work anymore. It is so long since I've done it.
But assuming that it did, that mitigates the backup issue a little bit.
It does, but the other reason is transactions. It's builder supporting ACID transactions. We have duplicate data in there that we believe shouldn't be there, and the duplicate data isn't in our primary data in MySQL. I'm still working on the assumption that there is a bug in the code I'm writing that takes the data and puts it in Neo4j, but I haven't found it. Any more questions? No? If you do use it, I'd love to hear how you get on. I'd love to have some feedback, positive or negative. So if you maybe, you know, but if you try it and you go, well, actually, it's a crock of shit, and we couldn't replicate your results, that's worth me knowing as well. All right.
We should move this to
Yes.
once with the outbound office.
All right. Thank you for having me.